Hi everyone, this is Haolak and welcome to another Java tutorial session. In today's tutorial I will cover the concept static. Okay, so here I have two classes. One is called superclass and another one called subclass. You can think of superclass as being, for example, an invoice class. Okay, it will become clear. Now, the reason why this tutorial will be split into a number of parts. So I'll cover the easiest concept with respect to static. Okay, now let's get started. Now, static is used to represent the class. Okay, so for example, instance method in our previous tutorials, an instance method belongs or is owned or can be owned by an object, okay, by an instance. However, class or a static, okay, so they're synonymous, class and static. You hear that? So a class or static variable or a class or static method belongs to the class. Okay, so let's get started. Okay, so first, now what I want to do is show how a static variable can be used as a counter. Okay, so for example here, in my superclass, what I'm going to do is there's nothing there, okay, and really we don't really even need anything in this. Okay, but what I want to do here is actually create a number of superclass object. Okay, so superclass, let's call it 1. Alright. So there. Okay, so everything still works. We'll add more to the superclass after. And we can have another superclass object. Okay, so call it 2. Okay, so you can think of these two as synonymous to, for example, you're creating, if a superclass is an invoice class, right? And each invoice you create, you want to keep count of how many invoice you created, and that's what we're going to do. Okay. Now, notice that these are the no-arg constructor. Okay, which is given by default. You always get a no-arg constructor when you create a class. Okay. So, however, we're going to do something with this. Okay, so we're going to actually do explicitly show, all right, do a count each time this is actually created. All right. So here we go. I'm going to call it counter. Okay. And each time we create an object, we're going to count. All right. So I'm going to create this as a field. Okay. So by default, you see it's final, and I don't want it to be final here. So what I wanted to actually do is actually turn this into a static. Okay, so private static. Right, and because it is static, this is shared by the class, right? Okay. So here I'm going to initialize it to 0. Okay. And the intent is actually to show that each time a class, an object is created, this counter will go up. Okay, so that's what I want to do. So now, okay, right. I'm going to add setters and getters for both. Right, since they're private. Okay, so now you notice that this is because it's private. You notice the static, right? You remove the static, it won't work because counter is private. If I made it public, okay, then we don't need these, but for now we're going to need this. Okay, so let's print that out and see what happens, and then I'll show why it's different from instance methods or an instant variable. Okay, so now get, right, get counter. Where did it go? Oh, sorry. Because this is static. Right? This is static. I don't know what I'm thinking. So this is static. We need to, when we actually call it, we have to call it with the class name, right? Because remember, it's not owned, get counter and set counter and counter is not owned by any particular object, right? It's owned by the class. So you have to call it with the class name. So notice the uppercase, okay? So we do get count, right? We can do it for each, okay? So I'm gonna do that. All right, I'm gonna move it up so you can see, okay? All right, and to actually get it, what we want to do is actually print this out. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna do it in here so we don't have to keep on printing it. Okay, so all right, so I'm actually gonna print this in here. The counter is now at, right, so there we go, and then counter. Okay, there we go. Then we return it. Yeah. But I'm just invoking, we're not printing in here, we're actually printing in there. Okay. Now if we run this, you see that the counter, right, will be at 2. Right? See that? So the counter is now at 1 after we created the 1, the first object, and now the counter is now at 2. Alright, so that's static. So it's shared by the class, okay? It's not owned by any particular object, right? So now for an instance variable, okay? So if we have an instance variable, okay, let's just say we have an instance variable for each class, and the instance variable is let me see. We can set it, right? So let's just say that we set this. Okay, I'm going to change the constructor a bit. So I'm going to set this and pass it. Let's say let's just say that for an instance variable. Okay, so we're going to have an instance variable and let's just call it ID. Okay, so we're going to call it ID, and I'm going to leave that as being blank. Okay. However, each time an object is created, what we're going to do is actually add on top of that a number. Okay, so that it's just for demonstration purposes. So I'm going to add. Let's just say we can do a random number, but let's just say this added by 100. Okay. And this will be the counter. Okay, so this is how our ID would look like. Okay, so I'm gonna create the setter and getter for it. Okay, so we have access to that. All right, so this is what it'll look like. Okay, now what I want to do is actually show that these are actually different. Okay, so the ID will be different from the counter because the ID is actually every instance that's created. Okay, that's instantiated. Right, will have its own copy of the ID instance variable. All right. So now that we do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to print this. So I'm going to print this again before I return it. So I'm going to do a print to avoid all the print in main. All right. Again, this is something that you wouldn't do print in here. Okay. This is just for demonstration purposes. So. Your ID is, right? So I'm going to do that and then just type ID. Okay, there we go. So now you notice that up here we called it with the class name, right? Now down here, okay, we can't call it with a class name because it doesn't. You can't do it. Okay, so if I try this and do that, you see that there's no set ID or get ID. Okay, so it has to. This is owned by the object. Okay, so because this is an instance method. Okay, so let me just put that in the instance method. Okay, this is class static or class method. Okay, they're synonymous. Right? So same here. instance variable, and this is a static or class variable. Okay, so that's what we have. And then down here we do the same thing. Okay, but we do it with superclass 2 object, get ID, right? And you're gonna notice that they are different. Okay, so they are not shared. Okay, okay, that's not a very good. Okay, what I want to do is actually demonstrate, because this is not a good example. Okay, let's go back. Okay, and show that. Okay, let's keep that. I'm gonna do something else. Okay, so counter. Okay, I'm gonna keep that. Now, what I'm gonna do is actually use the set on the second object. Okay, on the second object, I'm gonna set the second one before I print it out. So I'm gonna do superclass 2. And I'm gonna do set. I set ID, and I'm gonna set it like a really different number. Okay. All right, and I'm gonna call it. Now we'll take a look. Okay. Okay, so now you notice that it's changed, right? And if I print again, right? If I print superclass ID, the first one, okay? So if I get the first one, it's going to be the same as, it's going to be 101, okay? All right, so just to show you that when we actually change the ID on one object, for example, superclass 2, right? I broke the pattern and said, well, I'm going to initialize the ID to this. Right? It doesn't affect superclass 1 object. Okay. However, all right, if I set this counter, all right, so let's just say I set this counter. Okay. So if I go down here and I set the counter, all right, I set the counter to 200. Okay. If I set this counter and then I print it out again, okay. There's only one option. It's going to affect the entire class. Again, it is not owned by any one object. Okay, so there's only one copy of counter for the entire class. While for an instance method, an instance variable, there's a copy for each object that's instantiated. Okay, so this is a very simple introduction into a static. In the next tutorial, I will go more in depth about more of it, about the static concept. Okay, thanks for watching and take care. Bye.